Dust motes danced in the single beam of light piercing the gloom. It was as if the room had been frozen in time, untouched by the world outside. The light, though faint, was a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness that seemed to swallow everything else. Each mote of dust suspended in the air told a story of neglect and abandonment. The air hung heavy, thick with the silence of ages. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that seemed to press down on the very soul. The room felt like a forgotten relic, a place where time had stood still. The weight of the years was palpable, and the silence was almost deafening in its intensity.
This apartment, with its peeling paint and musty smell, feels like a tomb. The walls, once vibrant, were now faded and cracked, bearing the scars of time. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a musty odor that clung to everything. It was as if the very essence of the place was steeped in sorrow and neglect. I have a bad feeling about this. The unease was almost tangible, a creeping sensation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Every creak, every shadow seemed to whisper of unseen dangers. It was a feeling that gnawed at the edges of my mind, refusing to be ignored.
"Don't mind the sounds," the landlord had rasped, his single eye gleaming in the dim hallway. His voice was like gravel, rough and unsettling. There was something about him, something that set my nerves on edge. His presence was as disconcerting as the apartment itself, adding to the sense of foreboding that hung in the air. "The building's settling, that's all." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they had the opposite effect. The creaks and groans of the old building sounded like the whispers of ghosts, echoing through the empty halls. It was as if the very structure of the place was alive, shifting and settling in response to some unseen force. His words echoed in the cavernous space. The emptiness of the apartment seemed to amplify every sound, turning even the smallest noise into a haunting echo. It was a place that seemed to thrive on silence, a silence that was both oppressive and unnerving.
I have to make this work. I have nowhere else to go. The thought was both a comfort and a curse. This place, with all its flaws and fears, was my last refuge. I had no choice but to make it my home, to find some semblance of peace within its walls. But the unease lingered, a constant reminder of the unknown dangers that might lurk in the shadows.
Placing her suitcase down, she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The room was small and cramped, the walls closing in like a vice. The peeling wallpaper and the dim light only added to the sense of claustrophobia. But this was her reality now, and she had to face it head-on. She flicked on the light switch, hoping for some semblance of normalcy. The bulb flickered to life, casting a pale, sickly light over the room. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The light, though weak, was a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. A pale light flickered on and she surveyed her new home. It was far from perfect, but it was hers. The shadows seemed to retreat slightly, giving her a moment of respite. She took in the worn furniture, the cracked walls and the dusty floors. It was a place that had seen better days, but it was a place she could call her own. The shadows seemed deeper now, more menacing. They clung to the corners of the room, lurking just out of sight. It was as if they were waiting, biding their time. But she refused to be intimidated. This was her home now, and she would not let the darkness win. She would find a way to bring light into this place, to banish the shadows once and for all. The first night, it was just a whisper, a soft sigh that snaked from the walls as Emma lay in bed, her body tense with exhaustion and apprehension.
What was that?
The second night, the whispers returned, louder this time, accompanied by the soft scraping sound of fingernails on wood.
It's just the pipes.
But deep down, a primal fear began to blossom in her chest. The walls seemed to pulsate around her. The building has a history, a dark and unsettling one that has whispered through the walls for decades. Its very foundation seems to be soaked in secrets, each brick holding a tale of its own. The air around it is thick with an eerie silence, as if the building itself is holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter of its story to unfold. The old woman across the hall confided, her voice a raspy whisper. "This place, it has seen things, terrible things. People have come and gone, but some, they just vanished without a trace."
People disappeared years ago. They say the walls have eyes and the shadows They have a life of their own. It's as if the building itself is alive, feeding on the fear and despair of its inhabitants.
Emma had bumped into her while collecting her mail, the woman's eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and fear. It was as if she wanted to say more, to warn Emma of the dangers lurking within the walls, but something held her back. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was the knowledge that some secrets are better left buried.
The landlord, he knows, but he won't say. He walks these halls with a knowing look, his eyes darting to the shadows as if expecting something to emerge. He holds the keys, not just to the apartments, but to the secrets that lie within.
She shuffled back into her apartment, closing the door with a resounding thud. The sound echoed through the hallway, a stark reminder of the isolation and fear that permeated the building. Emma stood there, her mind racing with questions and her heart pounding in her chest. Emma stared at the closed door, her blood running cold. What had she gotten herself into? The stories, the whispers, the fear in the old woman's eyes. They all pointed to something sinister, something that was waiting in the shadows.
Don't mind the sounds. What is he hiding? Emma's thoughts swirled as she tried to piece together the puzzle. The creaks and groans of the building seemed to take on a new meaning, each sound a clue to the mystery that lay hidden within. She knew she had to find out, but the question was, at what cost? What?
The whispers escalated to muffled sobs, then to gut-wrenching screams that seemed to claw their way out from the very walls themselves. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, as if the building itself was suffocating its inhabitants. Emma could feel the vibrations of the screams reverberating through her bones, each one more intense than the last. It was as if the walls were alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that sought to consume her. The walls seemed to bulge and breathe, as if something monstrous was trying to break free. Shadows danced and twisted, creating grotesque shapes that played tricks on her mind. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a desperate plea for escape.
What is happening? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of screams. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of normalcy, but finding none.
Emma's sleep became a terrifying dance with nightmares and sudden awakenings. Each time she closed her eyes, she was plunged into a world of darkness and despair, where the screams were louder and more relentless. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, and the echoes of the screams still ringing in her ears. She tried to reason with herself, to find a logical explanation for the horrors she was experiencing. Maybe it was just faulty plumbing, she thought, or perhaps rats in the walls. Anything but the truth that clawed at the edges of her sanity. The old rusty pipes groaned and creaked, adding to the symphony of terror that filled the building. She would often find herself staring at them, hoping to catch a glimpse of the source of the sounds, but always coming up empty-handed. The rats, too, seemed to be part of the building's sinister design. They scurried through the walls, their tiny claws scratching and scraping, adding to the cacophony of fear. Emma could hear them at all hours, their presence a constant reminder of the building's malevolence. She clutched her head in anxiety, trying to block out the sounds and the thoughts that threatened to drive her mad. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong.
"Get out!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the empty halls. "Get out while you still can!" She ran through the dark hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape, but deep down, she knew there was no way out.
But deep down, she knew. The building was alive. It had a will of its own, a dark and twisted desire to consume all who entered. And Emma was its latest victim, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Then came the night the walls bled. A horrifying tableau emerged from the plaster, ghostly hands reaching, grasping, their fingers elongated and skeletal.
Oh my God!
Faces, contorted in silent screams, materialized on the surface, their eyes burning with a cold, ethereal light. Emma stumbled back, her scream dying in her throat as a cold dread washed over her. She was trapped in a nightmare.
No, this can't be real!
The faces seemed to watch her, their expressions hungry, malevolent. She tried to flee, her hand grasping for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in, the air thick with the stench of decay from which there was no escape. Then came the night the walls bled. A horrifying tableau emerged from the plaster, ghostly hands reaching, grasping, their fingers elongated and skeletal.
Oh my God!
Faces, contorted in silent screams, materialized on the surface, their eyes burning with a cold, ethereal light. Emma stumbled back, her scream dying in her throat as a cold dread washed over her. She was trapped in a nightmare.
No, this can't be real!
The faces seemed to watch her, their expressions hungry, malevolent. She tried to flee, her hand grasping for the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in, the air thick with the stench of decay and despair.
Please, let me out!
The ghostly apparitions advanced, their forms solidifying, their icy fingers brushing against her skin. Emma closed her eyes, a sob escaping her lips.
I'm going to die here.
She was going to die here. A young man stood nervously in the doorway, his eyes wide as he surveyed the apartment. He too felt the chill, sensed the wrongness that permeated the very air he breathed.
Is it always this cold in here?
Don't mind the sounds, the building's settling, that's all.
The landlord chuckled, his single eye glinting with an unsettling light. He pocketed the first month's rent, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips.
Welcome to your new home.
The door closed behind the new tenant, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. The landlord lingered for a moment, listening, a knowing smile spreading across his face.
Ah, there it is.
The faint sound of whispers, barely audible at first, rose from within the apartment. The cycle had begun again, and the walls, they remembered,